Hey guys, so continuing our review, we are now going to move on into quadratic functions. The graph of a quadratic function looks something like this, where it's a parabola. Either it will point up or down, and the vertex is always the minimum or the maximum. So let's actually go through all of the attributes that we need to know and make sure we know where they're located on the graph. So the first one is if they were to ask you for the zeros. Zeros are where the parabola touches the x-axis. But the confusing thing is they also go by other names. So, of course, zeros, but they are also called solutions, roots, or just plain and simple x-intercepts. So all of those mean the same thing, which, if I'm looking at my graph up here, these two spots. I'm going to label it 0 just because that's the one that's most commonly used. Also, just know that a parabola either has two zeros, like the one that's shown here. It might only have one, or it might have 0. Okay, next thing is the y-intercept. This one's self-explanatory. It's where the parabola touches the y-axis. Formula, so if you have an equation, this is going to be, if you were to plug in 0, that'll get you your y-intercept. So up here, y-intercept, boom. Okay, next thing is axis of symmetry. So this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated. The vertical line that divides the parabola into two equal halves, it will always go through the vertex. So there is a formula for this, and it is x equals negative b over 2a. So in our picture here, the axis of symmetry, it won't be drawn in. It's the imaginary line that cuts it right in half. Okay, so next thing is the vertex. And this will be the highest or the lowest point of the parabola, so it kind of depends. The x-coordinate of the vertex will be the same as the axis of symmetry. Okay, so looking here, this is my vertex. So see what I mean? Like, as long as you know your axis of symmetry, it's going through that line. Now, the thing about a vertex is it could either be the maximum or the minimum. So speaking of that, it's the y value of the vertex. So remember, all points are x comma y. You really only want the y value if they're asking you for the max or min. So you're going to plug in your axis of symmetry. And just be careful. If your graph is pointing up like this, you're going to have a minimum. If your graph is pointing down, you're going to have a maximum. Okay, then domain and range. Domain is all possible x values, and range is all possible y values. Now, as long as there's arrows on both sides of your parabola, domain is always going to be all real numbers. I mean, if there's a stopping point, then of course that changes, but arrows will be all real numbers. The y value, so for the range, it's a little different, and we're going to use our vertex to help us out with the range. So that's how you find everything just by looking at a picture. So I have two examples that I want to go over. So here's our first one. So we don't even have equations. We're just going to look directly at the picture and describe everything. So starting with the zeros. So zeros means where it hits the x-axis. So those two orange dots. So zeros are at, I'm going to write this as a set, so it's a curly bracket, +1 and +5. Or in fact, I think I'm going to separate it. So x equals 1, x equals 5. Okay, y-intercept. So y-axis, look to see where it crosses. And it's crossing at y equals 5. Axis of symmetry. So if you were to cut it down the middle, where would that line land? And it's always going to be x equals, and if you look at your x-axis, 3. Minimum or maximum. So since this is at the very bottom, this is a minimum. And we're going to write it just the value. So we look at our y-axis, kind of go across. The lowest that it ever is at that -4. So for vertex, you just got to put these two numbers together, 3, -4. And you'll see that if you just get to the point. So 3, -4. Okay, last, domain and range. See how there's arrows on both sides of that parabola. So our domain is going to be all real numbers. And then for range, yes, there's arrows on the top, so it's going to keep going forever this way. But as far as down, it stops. So we always use the letter y because range goes with y. We look at our y-axis to find the number, so -4. But now we need to know what symbol. Do I want everything above that point or below? So I want above, so that means that I need the greater than or equal to symbol. All right, let's look at one more graph and do the same thing. So here we are. Let's start with our zeros. So the two places where it crosses the x-axis. It crosses at x equals -2 and again at x equals 0. Y-intercept just so happens to also be on top of one of those x-intercepts, so it's going to be at y equals 0. It goes through the origin. Okay, axis is symmetry. Where would I have to draw my line if I wanted to cut this parabola in half? And that is at x equals -1. Maximum or minimum, so this time it is a maximum because it's at the very top. And I'm going to get the vertex first. So if I had to do that as a point, that's -1, +1. Which means that my maximum value is just that y equals +1. Okay, last, let's do our domain and range. So there's arrows on both sides. That means that domain is all real numbers. And then for range, it stops about right here where I'm drawing my line. So I'm going to use the letter y, the number +1, and now I have to decide, do I want everything above that line or below that line? Well, I want below, so that's going to be the less than or equal to symbol. All right, guys, that's how you find all of the attributes just by looking at a picture, and tomorrow we'll go over more about how you would do this on a calculator.